Hello, my name is Colin Asani Collins. In today's video, I will be discussing the slavery reform. Abolition was the greatest reform crusade early in the 19th century, for slavery was the most immoral, compared to alcohol. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the only supporters were Quakers, slaves, and free black people. But at the turn of the 19th century, when colonization was widespread, they wished to send all former slaves back to Africa, and the American Colonization Society was made famous and rich enough to settle Liberia as a free homeland for former slaves. This was unrealistic, but found favor to politicians such as Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. Some chose to emigrate to Liberia, since they already figured that America would never treat them as equals. Most people, however, were against that. As a matter of fact, 3,000 of them gathered in the state of Philadelphia and announced that black people should have the same rights as white people in 1817. 13 years later, champions for the abolition of slavery became more extreme, such as William Lloyd Garrison, who had a magazine, The Liberator, which was published in 1831. He was recognized for being painfully honest. He once burned the Constitution, claiming it was a pact with the devil. Radical abolitionism became a campaign hugely because it reused the same old fascinating speeches and storytelling that people saw in the ministers of the Second Great Awakening. They all taught the same message, however, which was that slavery was a sin. 100,000 Northerners were arranged with the American Anti-Slavery Society by 1843. The significance transcended ending slavery, but that all humans should have equal rights no matter the race. Abolitionists renamed Old State House Bell the Liberty Bell. Opposers to abolition were often rambunctious, such as in 1838, where a mob in Philadelphia committed arson against the Pennsylvania Hall because it held anti-slavery meetings there. 1 year later, a group in Alton, Illinois, killed abolitionist editor Elijah P. Lovejoy when he was protecting his printing press. Congress adopted the Act of Suppressing Freedom of Speech and Press Act by enacting the gag rule in 1836. This prevented members of the Congress from reading out loud or talking about the calls for the liberation of slaves. The most known abolitionist was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who was mainly renowned for his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Josiah Henderson also had an autobiography, which later served as the foundation for his famous anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold quite well, despite being difficult to read. It was banned across the whole South. According to William W. Gwaltney, author, historian, Frederick Douglass was remarkable, with a tall nose, expressive eyes, and a manly chin. He was a towering man of about 6'2", wide-shouldered, brawny, and a human who liked to keep himself in a powerful and compelling demeanor. On Maryland's eastern shore, he wasn't sure of his birth. He thought maybe he was born in 1817, but records say that he was born in February 1818 to a slave named Harriet, as Frederick Augustus. He knew his mother and believed his father was white and his master. He lived in the quarters of his slave master, Edward Lloyd, which was quite huge. Frederick Douglass was raised by his grandmother until he was 6, when he was appointed to be the partner and babysitter of the daughter of the plantation. At this moment, his eyes were open to the fact that he was no longer a kid, but a slave, and could be punished for the things he did and things he didn't do. Shortly after arriving there, he witnessed the horrific whipping of his Aunt Hester, and to him it was dehumanizing. He pondered why some were free and some weren't. This led him to crave freedom all the more. Later in life, when he was transported to another plantation, the wife of the slave owner taught him how to read. She treated him as her child. She even taught him how to read the Bible, as she struggled to read herself. At 15, he was moved from the plantation to urban life in Baltimore, where he watched firsthand what urban life is like. His occupation was a ship's caulker. This was the first job he could keep his pay, so he eagerly saved to buy his first book, The Columbian Orator, and memorized the whole book. He later found free blacks in even religious communities. He felt he belonged. He then found the love of his life, Anna Murray, who supported him until the end. Anna and Frederick, in 1838, hatched a plan to escape. She sold a poster bed and handed him money to aid him. He had papers that permitted him to pass as a sailor, since black sailors were regular sights, which meant he could pass anywhere. He traveled from Baltimore, Wilmington, and Philadelphia, a free state. Later, he continued to New York and joined Anna Murray. Soon after they got married, shortly after, they moved to New Bedford in New Massachusetts. Upon looking for a job, Frederick Douglass experienced racism firsthand in a free state because white shipwrights wouldn't work alongside black ones. Despite his skill and sadness, he became a common laborer. He learned of the abolition movement after living in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He knew of William Lloyd Garrison, an immediatist who wanted slavery to end immediately. The Liberator sparked interest in Frederick Douglass. Eventually he traveled to Nantucket to attend an American anti-slavery meeting. He was asked to speak because Garrison found out an escaped slave was in the crowd. He shared with all his heart his account of being a slave. For about 2 hours, the audience was intrigued. At this moment, the anti-slavery movement was more solid than ever. When he became an abolitionist speaker, he was often attacked by pro-slavery advocates. This didn't stop him from becoming a convincing writer. His first book was published in 1845 called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It was a highly detailed autobiography. It even gave information about his owners as an escape. Knowing that he is still an escaped slave and his owners may be looking for him, it's a risk he took. In fear, he fled to England. His friends bought him for legally binding that he, in a manner, now is free. In 1847, he came back to America as a free man. Soon after, he moved to Rochester and started his newspaper, the North Star. He wanted this for all black people. Likewise, in this time that he gained in a political mindset in the early 1840s and 1850s. Subsequently, he became known to John Brown and became close friends with him, but he rejected his raids and strongly disagreed. The Civil War broke out on April 12, 1861, bringing joy to Frederick Douglass's heart. To him, it meant freedom and equality for all African Americans. However, the North would not allow black men to join the Army, which later weakened the Union. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln, freeing all slaves and allowing black soldiers to fight in the Civil War, but their conditions were dire. This led him to write a letter to President Lincoln on August 10, 1863, and agreed to meet him immediately. During their meeting, President Lincoln spoke first. He understood that Frederick Douglass was very critical of him. Their conversation made lasting marks on them, and former President Lincoln promised to fix the state of the black soldiers. Douglass penned another letter to President Lincoln. He did not let me feel for a moment that there was any difference in the color of our skins. The President is a most remarkable man. With the help of Frederick Douglass, President Lincoln won the war, united the Union, and won a second term. Triumphantly on March 4, 1865, Frederick Douglass attended the inauguration of President Lincoln, whose speech was dedicated to black people, who were 1/8 of the population, and yet again he was invited to the White House for the reception. And President Lincoln saw him from afar and yelled, "Here comes my friend, Frederick Douglass. There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours." December 6, 1865, was a lovely and victorious day, for the 13th Amendment was passed, legally abolishing slavery in the United States. Frederick Douglass, born and escaped slavery, never wavered to fight for the freedom because he understood, without struggle there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. On the grim night of April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while watching a comedy, Our American Cousin, in Ford's Theater together with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, his officer, Major Henry Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The deadly bullet passed through the former president's left ear and struck behind his right eye. The president was incapacitated and could barely breathe. 9 hours passed, and President Lincoln died at 7:22 on April 15, 1865. John Wilkes Booth was shot and apprehended in a barn where he was hiding near Bowling Green, Virginia. He succumbed to his wounds and died later the same day on April 26, 1865. President Lincoln was assassinated standing up for all of America's freedom and equality, but the Confederacy despised him for it.